a general discussion about mental health. It is not to be interpreted as specific advice for a specific situation. Every situation is unique and requires advice to be tailored and adapted to that situation. All information in this broadcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you or a loved one are experiencing mental health distress, please speak to a licensed professional in your area.
It's time to shine that light that lives in you. Living well. It's not too late to change. It's time to be the change. Living well. It's time to shine that light that lives in you. Living well. It's not too late to change. It's time to be the change.
Living Well takes a community. So remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share with a friend. Welcome to Living Well, where we attend to the mind, the heart, the body, and the soul. We are smack dab in the middle of our series, Black Love Christian Style. Now I want to ask you a question. Are you in a long-term relationship, or have you been in a long-term relationship and it seems a little stale? Seems like the spark is gone, or there's a lack of connectedness? Well, you may have experienced some threats to intimacy. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of intimacy and how to get that spark back, how to cultivate the connectedness, the love and affection that you desire in your romantic partnerships. We have a special guest for you today who her whole job every day, all day, is to talk to couples about intimacy and their sexual lives. So stay with us. This is Living Well, and I'm Dr. Erica Holmes. All right, y'all, it is time for the water cooler, where we come out of our psychologist's office, stand around the water cooler and talk about those things that are hot right now. What is everybody talking about? What does everybody need to be talking about? So you know how we do it. We're going to watch this quick clip, and then Dr. Lark and I are going to come back and talk about it.
I learned that intimacy is the only thing I'm looking for. Intimacy really means that someone knows you, everything about you, good and bad, and loves you anyway. That's all every man is looking for. You can't get intimacy without vulnerability. It's impossible, because you're going to have to tell your stuff. If you can't tell, you'll never find intimacy. So what happens is you get sex. Sex and love, two different things. Lots of sex. And it's always unfulfilling because you're not getting what you need.
Into me you see.
Yeah. Terry Crews spoken.
All things intimacy.
Yes, yes. I love, there's nothing more attractive than watching a man, particularly a Black man, be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And for him to talk about, he said, you can't have intimacy without vulnerability. Like, he's laid it out there. And that is so true. Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to be open and be vulnerable. And it's not just about sex. So I like that. It's nothing more attractive than a vulnerable man.
I think in today's society, we have not put enough emphasis on intimacy and true intimacy. I think it's important for us to recognize that whether you're in a romantic partnership or whether you're in a friendship with the girlfriends or your guy friends, that intimacy is a foundation for a true relationship, regardless of what the relationship is.
True.
For a relationship to be fulfilling, for it to be emotionally connected and supported, that relationship has to have intimacy, which requires vulnerability, right? There has to be safety for there to be vulnerability, but we don't talk about that need to be open in order for connections to occur. And so we're talking about in this series, romantic relationships, right? Love and romantic relationships. And we've erroneously kind of created intimacy or talked about intimacy and sex as interchangeable concepts. And so what has happened is there's a whole lot of focus now on relationships, that's sex. And this is how I know if we're closer. And it's like, that's why so many people, I believe, are feeling unfulfilled in their relationship.
Yeah, I would agree. And he even, spoke about that, because there's this, when you think about intimacy and, like he said, how you need vulnerability, I think along with that comes like this transparency that is so important. And like you said, whether it's in an intimate relationship or just, other friendships, true relationships need to have the intimacy. And what came to mind for me as he was talking was this idea of being like completely naked before your partner, and not always in its physical sense, but completely naked and transparent so that I can be seen. And I think that is so important in relationships.
I agree. And I mean, even, from a Christian standpoint, for those who are practicing celibacy, your relationship has to therefore, the foundation has to be something more than just sexual.
Absolutely.
And as you get older, I'll never forget, words of wisdom from my mother-in-law, that I've mentioned her before. I remember that she told me when my husband and I were getting married, and she and my father-in-law had been married over 50 years. He passed away well into his 80s. And she was like, if there's one thing you need to know, you got to have something more than sex. I'm doing an impression of her. You got to have something more than sex if the relationship is going to last.
Yeah.
There's going to come a time, a day, a month, or a year where you're not going to be able to have sex. And I was like, whoa. And she was like, so you got to have something more. And this is this idea of being connected on a physical level, which is touch, right? Not sexual intimacy, but physical intimacy, or intellectual intimacy, which is sharing those deepest thoughts, the way your critical thoughts, the way that you think about things, your belief system. There's spiritual intimacy where you're sharing your innermost thoughts about being connected to God and to the divine. There is recreational intimacy,
yes,
where you are sharing in experimental and recreational activities that are new things that you're discovering, with your partner. There's emotional intimacy,
right,
where you are sharing your innermost emotions, whether it is your deepest sorrows or your greatest joys. So being able to connect with your partner on these various levels is so important. And I'll go back to what Terry Crews said in the clip. And they all require vulnerability.
Exactly. And, like you said, sexual intimacy, okay, that's short-lived. It won't last. And more importantly, it won't always lead to fulfillment.
Right.
There's sex and sex and sex. And to your point, as we talk about several different types of intimacy, you got to have something more, because there may be a time when there's a physical injury or anything like that where you're unable to get the sexual intimacy, but you need something else to sustain you.
Right.
Something else to sustain the marriage and sustain the relationship.
Right.
Therein lies the emotional connection, the intellectual intimacy,
right,
the different areas of intimacy that will sustain you when sexual intimacy is not even possible.
Although sexual intimacy, we ain't gonna downplay it. It's nice.
Not at all. It is very important.
Right.
And it has
It's nice.
Function and a purpose, and
yes,
it's good.
Yes.
However,
yes,
it is not the only form of intimacy that will sustain a marriage.
Exactly. It will not sustain a marriage. And I think that is also important for us to say that if the thought or idea of being that vulnerable with your partner is scary to the point where you are hindered from doing it, then that's a sign that you might need help. You might need to speak to a therapist or a pastoral counseling, to seek pastoral counseling or something like that in order to help you to connect, because that's the only way that your relationship will be sustained.
Absolutely.
And I think that now is a perfect time to stop and bring in our guest for today.
Yes.
You've seen her here before on the Living Well stage. When we come back, we will have a conversation with Dr. Jeshana Johnson, the owner and founder of theintimacyseminars.com. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. We are joined by our fabulous guest, Dr. Johnson. Thank you so much for joining us again. We enjoyed you so much last time. We had to have you back.
Well, you know what? It's an honor to be back. So I'm in good company and love being here.
Yeah, you like talking about intimacy and sex.
Yeah. I do. You got me there.
So, we are actually in the midst of a series called Black Love Christian Style. And
love that.
Yes. And so what we really wanted to talk about is intimacy and the importance of intimacy in relationships, which I think so many people underestimate, or they only think about one type of intimacy. So let's just start off by defining intimacy. What is it and why is it important?
Intimacy is courage. It is showing up. It is allowing yourself to be accurately seen, with an emphasis on accurate, because it's easy for us to show the parts of us that are the good, the highlight reels, but the parts of us that we may not feel so good about. But intimacy is the courage to show up and be accurately seen, allowing people to be active and intentional in your life, as well as you being active and intentional in someone else's life. Why is it important? Well, God created us as social beings. He created us for connection. And, it talks, in Adam and Eve, in that story, it talks about Adam knowing Eve. So I think it is important because we are designed for connection. The research shows that if we go long periods without intimacy deprivation, that it has a direct impact on our physical, our mental health. And we also have uppers, good neurochemicals that are released. And so when we participate in any type of intimacy, like you said, there's more than just sexual intimacy. We participate in any type of intimacy, we have those uppers like serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin and endorphins that are released. And we also know that when we don't have these types of intimacies and it's not released in us, that atrophy for those neural pathways can set in. So it's good for our health.
Bottom line.
It's good for our health and it's necessary for our survival.
Why do you think so many people currently intimacy is distilled down into sex? Like when people say intimacy, and they'll use it interchangeably now, like intimacy, sex, like interchangeably. When we know, because of the work that we do, that intimacy is broader than just sex, and there are various types of intimacy that you can have with a person. But why do you think that most people kind of only think about sex at this point?
I think for the most part, we live in a world of patriarchy, right? And so when we think about what is considered or socialized to consider what is intimate for men, then we tend to highlight sex. But I think that also sets men up for problems as well, because men don't just desire sex. They desire to have emotional, mental, spiritual, intellectual connections with their spouses. So we struggle, one, because we don't really truly understand what intimacy is. And then two, we socialize people to think intimacy is sex. And we know intimacy does not equal sex.
That's an inside joke. Yes, you are right.
Oh, I love it. So, given that we know that there are several different types of intimacy, and you just spoke about sex, but what is that overall thing? Like, why do you think couples just struggle so much with just intimacy, period? Or the lack of true intimacy? Like, why do they struggle?
Well, Intimacy is heavily seated in selfhood. And if you're,
What do you mean by that?
so if our sense of self is not well developed, then we can only tolerate certain amount of intimacy because it's too revealing, right? And so when we talk about like emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy, like even financial intimacy, I think people want to be seen, but not that close. When you take a microscope to who we are, let's just say spiritual intimacy. If you take a microscope to who we are as a spiritual person, it's easy to show Instagram and Facebook who you are as a spiritual person.
Right.
But when people really begin to look at you, when the cameras is off, when the lights are dimmed and no one's looking, how are you showing up as in your spiritual intimacy? That is very vulnerable, and it takes courage for people to know the ins and outs of you. How you spend money, how you save money. You start looking at people up close. People don't want to be seen that much. So when it comes to intimacy, people will begin to pull away from it and hide from that because it feels too revealing. I work with couples a lot of times, and we do what we call like eye gazing, like looking into, and couples who have been married for a long time really struggle with that because they're really being seen. And so that can get in the way of intimacy because it's vulnerability.
Wow.
Yeah. And I, just thinking about what you're saying, what came up for me is for so many of us, going through life, we've been hurt in various ways, right? By people who were supposed to love us. Small hurts, big hurts. And we carry those experiences into relationship. So then vulnerability becomes scary.
Not safe.
Exactly.
Right.
And if I show you my true self,
What will you do with it?
exactly. I can see that impacting, my desire, willingness to be vulnerable, to be open, to share those innermost parts of myself.
And I think too, we have to look at a historical aspect of just like when we're talking about Black love and the impact that, we have experienced just in the oppressions and things like that, and racism, and just really struggling in that area. That has an impact on our spiritual selves, our emotional selves, our mental selves. And if that has been impacted, how do you think we are going to be able to show up with vulnerability, courage, and truly be intimate and experience it in its true form?
Yeah.
That's definitely going to be impacted.
Yeah.
So how do you know if your relationship is lacking intimacy? Like what are some of the signs? Like I might be like, something is missing, but I don't know what it is. Or I'm not completely fulfilled or happy, but I don't know what it is. Like, how do you know?
Sometimes I tend to look at busyness. If you're too busy to be intimate with your partner, no, we're not talking about sex.
Right.
If you're too busy to be intimate with your partner, you're too busy, right? And so when we haven't cultivated this this desire to want to be with our partners, our desires to show up for them and show up for ourselves, we're lacking intimacy. Feelings of alone in a relationship, that has to be like the worst, right? To be alone and feel lonely is one thing, but to be with someone and feel lonely and alone is another thing. So these feelings of aloneness, lack of like simple affection, like simple touch. Sometimes we touch when there's an end goal, if you know what I mean, right? But the point of touching to be touched and to be known and to be felt is really important. So when you find yourself being busy and feeling alone and not touching for those reasons, for any reasons other than the end goal, then perhaps we're lacking intimacy in relationships.
Wow.
Now I want to go kind of like to the deep end. I'm just gonna ask this question and see what your thoughts are. And this is not general. I'm not saying all. But would you say that a sign or a symptom might be when you find yourself being, dare I say, stimulated or at least interested, for example, in conversations with other people outside of your marriage? Because if we only focus on sex, right?
Yeah.
A lot of us know, like we've talked about recently, these ideas of like emotional affairs.
Oh, yeah.
Where people are like, I'm on the phone with this person who's not my husband or wife, and we're having these deep conversations. That's intellectual intimacy.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's like, oh, well, you know, I love going bowling with this person. That's recreational or experimental intimacy.
Right.
And so if you're finding yourself wanting to do these things with other folks,
And
go ahead.
having a visceral reaction to your partner or spouse, having date night and you're looking for reasons to get out of it, but you're willing and wanting to spend time. Yes.
Danger.
Yes. A very, very slippery slope.
Yeah. And I think sometimes when you're not cultivating these various types of intimacy in your relationship, then you see them as lacking, or your partner not being able to meet it, and you look outside.
Absolutely.
And you start to look outside. And that's not to say to blame either whoever is doing
It's
it.
a symptom
Exactly.
of what's happening. in the
Exactly.
relationship.
And so
I think it's important to pay attention to that.
and you have to be intentional about creating those opportunities to cultivate and not disconnect from your spouse, to be connected with your spouse, even when there might be 50 other things that you have responsibility for.
Right. I think it's important. It kind of goes back to this idea of like understanding why you are doing it. If you find yourself, I'm curious about what this other person is doing, or I like going bowling with them, but I got somebody right here that I can go bowling with and do these things with, and I'm not, then ask myself, why?
What's happening?
What is happening? Why do I have an interest over here? And why is there this visceral reaction? What is happening here? So
the body is giving us
absolutely
information.
Yeah. And so when you find yourselves in those situations, I can only imagine that might be one example of a threat
Oh,
to
absolutely.
intimacy.
Absolutely.
So
It
talk
is-
about other threats.
So other threats, definitely. Not knowing who you are is a threat, because then you don't want to share. You don't want to share who you are with your spouse. Missing bids for connection is a threat.
Talk about that.
Yeah, right. I was going to say, talk about
Missing bids for connection. And it's so simple. Sometimes, your spouse may come home and say, did you see the news about, and you're like, and you carry on. And that was literally an opportunity for your spouse to connect with you on an intellectual level, to talk about what was interesting to them and what they felt about it. But we just dismiss it as, oh, here they go bringing up the news. I don't even watch the news. And that's the kind of attitude that we have. That's a threat to intimacy. Rule books. Rule books and playbooks are threats to intimacy. When we have a misconception about what intimacy is, especially because so many people think intimacy is sex, right? That is a threat to intimacy when you don't understand that there are other types of intimacy. And if we are under the impression that sex equals intimacy, sometimes when people who don't want to have sex, they will avoid any type of intimacy to keep from it leading to the end goal. So those are also threats to intimacy. Dishonesty, betrayal, trauma, all of these things are threats to intimacy. Not wanting to talk are threats to intimacy. How do you intimacy when you're not wanting to talk to your partner?
Yeah, that's good. I can see it really is about opportunities to connect, even in the slightest, in the smallest way. And what may seem so insignificant as, okay, I don't feel like talking. No, that's a huge thing, because it's an opportunity to connect. And staying connected is a way to increase the intimacy. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
You got to be connected to be intimate.
Right.
Like there's no if, ands, or buts about that. And I like this idea of bids for connection because I think, well, I know that you have to be interested in knowing your partner to be able to pick up on when there's signs, because life can get busy. Life can get busy. You know, we all live busy lives. We're doing this. If you have children at home, you're doing that, taking care of elderly parents, going to work, doing whatever your responsibilities at church, all of those things, and you could just kind of miss each other. But when you know your partner, when your partner's like, hey, what about me? And it might look a million different ways. There might be, you know, this intellectual bid like, oh, did you see such and such? You know, it might be them telling you a joke, a dad joke that they think is
super funny.
That you like, what? What? For my husband is paper cuts. When he come to me talking about, oh,
He
look
got
at
a paper
this.
cut.
Look at that. I be like, oh, okay, let me stop. Let me stop. Let me see it. Okay, let me sit down and be. Yeah, I'm like, the paper, really? So we see this right here? Sir, sir, big guy, sir. But you know, knowing your partner and picking up on those cues, like, oh, okay. Especially, I think, when you've been married or in the relationship for a long time, it's so easy to become complacent.
Yes. And, you know, I've been married for 28 years. And,
say it again.
Yeah,
That's celebrate that 28.
I have been married for 28 years, and it is easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day life and just moving.
Right.
And not being present is definitely a threat to intimacy.
When you talk about presence, you talking about physical presence or psychological, emotional presence?
All of it. Like, because we can be physically next to one another, but if we are caught up on our phones and scrolling and things like that, then we are not emotionally and psychologically present, and we dismiss the curiosity of wanting to know our spouses.
Most definitely. So those are threats to intimacy, things that we need to be aware of. But how can couples cultivate intimacy? How can they bring the spark back? How can they reconnect if they feel themselves being disconnected? What are some things they can do?
Short answer, I know a new book. Short answer, I know a new book that has just, you know, it's coming out and it's going to be very good. But really is about apologizing and meaning it. Right? Making date nights sacred and having rituals that you and your spouse look forward to. It's important to make sure that you are curious about who your partner is, and as you grow and as they grow, that you're constantly getting to know them. Letting your spouse in emotionally and mentally into your internal world. All those things that are going on in there, letting them in and sharing that, and being okay with them disagreeing with you, or, you know, not necessarily validating you, but really just showing up, not hiding. It's hard to be intimate when you have armor. Right? So taking off the mask, or not allowing the representative to show up into the marriage, to the relationship, is important.
I really like what you said about staying curious, because it makes me think about when you show curiosity, you are demonstrating that I see you and I'm interested in you. And that can be something as simple as asking a question about, you know, your day or about anything. But I think this idea, as long as, if I'm interested in you, then I'm also letting you know that I see you and I want to know you. I want to be close to you. I want, you know, to get in. Just think about how if we become interested in something, we go and pursue that thing that we might be interested in, or whatever we're curious about, we tend to explore more. And so I like the idea of maintaining the curiosity in your marriage and about your partner. I think that's a good one.
And there's a difference between saying, how was your day? And then, baby, how was your day?
Exactly.
Looking them in their eyes and stopping things to really be curious about what happened for them. My husband was telling me that he had like a flat tire on his way to work, but he didn't tell me until we got home. I was like, wait, babe, like, well, how did I not know this? And he was like, oh, well, I just didn't, feel like, I had the tow truck come and they changed the tire and I went on to work, and I was like, but I'm curious to make sure that you get to work safely.
Right.
So, he's been texting me now like, hey, I made it to work safely and good morning, and I'll, talk to you when you wake up. But him knowing that I cared about his safety is intimacy. It's those small things
and that are important. Responded.
Yes, absolutely,
like, oh,
absolutely.
Yeah. And that's why I was, it leads me to, what I was thinking when you said that, keeping date nights sacred, that you have calendars and rituals. And I like to think of cultivating intimacy in a relationship like daily, weekly, monthly, right? Yeah. That there should be something daily that you do with your spouse that creates moments of intimacy. And it does not have to be we carved out 30 minutes in an hour. It could be 5 minutes that we say we wake up early 5 minutes and we lay here and we cuddle before we jump out of bed, or 5 minutes before we go to sleep that, we get in the bed 5 minutes before we go to sleep together and we lay here and we cuddle, or, we pray before we start our day. Like that there should be something every day for 2 to 5 minutes that you do something and it's just you two in that moment. And then every week there should be an extended period of time where you're saying, you know what, this is our time. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk.
Check in.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? What went well this week in our relationship?
Right.
What went well in your life this week? What are some areas that you think we could have worked on in our relationship? Check-ins are important.
And what I appreciate about you this week. What did I notice about you this week? And then monthly, that we should have one day a month, whatever day, the one day a month that we should have where we are spending a bulk of time together. Yeah. For some people, if you have young children, it can be kind of difficult, but there should be 4 to 8 hours where you could say, this is us.
Yes.
Whether it's the kids are with a sitter or you get into like a parenting co-op where you all take time, but there should be at least one in, date night, whatever that is, that you have a bulk of time every month where you're like, we're together, it's just us, and we're doing things that we love, we enjoy, and that bring us closer.
That's really important, because I think sometimes we get the time that it takes to build intimacy mixed with instamacy. It takes time to build intimacy, and we have to be intentional about that, which means you have to carve out time. And we equate a lot of times intimacy with intensity and passion with pleasure, and all of that is great, but it's going to lead down a road of a short-lived path, right? And true intimacy takes time to build and to cultivate and being intentional about it. And so it's important for us to make sure that we're practicing intimacy and not instamacy.
That's good. That's good. With that, I think our time has come to a close.
It's always too short.
It's too short.
That means you have to come back.
Exactly. You have to come back. We really appreciate you being here. We always love having you on set with us. Dr. Jeshana Johnson, the owner and operator of theintimacyseminars.com. Yes. If you're looking for her, you can reach out to her there. And we want to thank you all for joining us again on another episode of Living Well. This is our series, Black Love, Christian Style. And we appreciate you for being here. And as always, we like to leave you with a resource, something that you can kind of further investigate to increase your knowledge about whatever, about today's topic. And so today I want to leave you with my book, my new book, which Dr. Johnson kind of mentioned, which is my latest book, Intimacy Does Not Equal Sex, 180 Activities to Help Couples Connect. It is hot off the press, and it will be available everywhere that you can buy books online. Check me out on Amazon. So get into finding ways and being intentional about cultivating connection with your mate. And with that, until we see you next time, we pray that you are living well. For more information and resources, be sure to check us out at normalizehelp.org. And you can always email us at livingwell@faithfamily.org to get a question answered or to tell us a story. You never know, your question might make it to air or be the subject of one of our episodes. See you next week.
It's not too late to change, it's time to be the change. It's time to shine that light that lives in you. It's not too late to change, now it's time to change. Now it's time to change, now it's time to change. Now it's time to change, time to change, time to change.